A 15-year-old sat calmly at home while a boy who would do anything for her went out to end the life of a girl she had never once met. Then, about 15 minutes later, she picked up the phone and called him, just to ask whether it was finished. When most of us imagine the kind of person capable of something like that, we imagine a grown man. We do not imagine a teenage girl with a phone, a crush, and a quiet, patient kind of rage. And yet, over the next few hours, that is exactly who you are going to meet, 10 different times. These are 10 true stories of girls, one of them only 12, who took the most ordinary feelings a person can have, love, jealousy, and the sting of being pushed aside, and let them harden into something almost no one walks away from. Every name, every date, every outcome here is real and verified. Section 1. The voicemail that came back. Sarah Ludeman was 18 years old, and the boy she had fallen for was the first one she ever let close. She was born on December 7th, 1990 in Pinellas Park, a flat, sunny stretch of Florida not far from the Gulf Coast. Her parents had waited a long time for her, and when she finally arrived, she became the center of their world. She was their only child. By every account from the people who knew her, she was a bright kid, straight A's, the kind of student teachers remember. She wanted to be a veterinarian one day because she loved animals, and for most of her short life, that plan looked completely reachable. She was not someone who chased drama. She had not really dated much at all. That part of her life only started when she met a young man named Joshua Camacho at a Chick-fil-A where he worked, somewhere around the summer of 2007. By that November, the two of them were officially together. For Sarah, it was a first serious relationship, and she fell hard. Her parents noticed the change in her, and according to later reporting, they grew uneasy about the boy their daughter had brought into her life. There were small warning signs. Some of the photos saved on Sarah's phone showed Josh posing with a handgun. But Sarah was in love, and at 18, love can drown out a lot of quieter instincts. Here is the part Sarah did not fully know at first. She was not the only girl in Josh Camacho's life. Rachel Wade had also been involved with him. Rachel was a little older, around 19, and she worked at an Applebee's restaurant. When she learned that Josh was spending time with Sarah too, something hardened in her. Years later, when this all reached a courtroom, Camacho would tell the jury something striking about both girls. He said he had never really thought of either of them as his girlfriend. To him, he claimed, they were casual, nothing serious. Two young women were tearing their lives apart over a boy who, by his own account, was not committed to either of them. That detail matters, and we will come back to it, because it sits at the center of how senseless the whole thing was. And it was even more senseless than it first appears, because there was a third young woman in the picture. By the account of police, Camacho had been juggling not 2, but 3 girls at the same time for around 8 months: Rachel, Sarah, and a young woman named Erin Slothour. Slothour was not a rival in quite the same way. She was the teenage mother of Camacho's infant daughter. So while 2 girls were sharpening their hatred for each other into something lethal, the boy at the center of it already had a child with someone else, and treated all of them, by his own description, as nothing serious. The geometry of the whole thing was rotten from the very start. Rachel and Sarah had each cast the other as the obstacle, when the one person actually connected to all of it never seems to have been seriously treated as the problem by either of them. It is worth pausing on who Rachel Wade actually was, because she did not fit the easy picture of a monster either. She was born in February 1990 to Barry and Janet Wade, which made her only a couple of months older than Sarah. By her late teens, she had already lived a harder, more independent life than most kids her age. She had dropped out of high school at 16, but rather than simply drifting, she had gone and earned her GED, taken the job at Applebee's, and was paying for her own apartment. Her high school yearbook had reportedly named her the biggest flirt. She had dated a string of boys, and she was first introduced to Josh through a live-in boyfriend of hers. When that relationship ended, she moved straight into orbit around Camacho. She was, in other words, an ordinary, somewhat headstrong young woman rather than a hardened criminal, which is part of what made the ending so hard for people to square. The rivalry between Rachel and Sarah did not explode all at once. It built slowly, the way these things often do now, in messages and posts and missed calls. It started in earnest around the middle of June 2008 on MySpace, which was the social platform teenagers lived on back then. The two girls began trading insults online, then it spread to text messages, then voicemails. For months they circled each other, each one convinced the other was the problem, each one feeding the fight a little more every week. It got physical in the petty ways first. At one point that summer, Sarah and some friends sprayed silly string all over a car belonging to one of Rachel's friends, and the police were called over it. Rachel, for her part, said Sarah and her friends would show up at the Applebee's where she worked just to needle her. By later accounts of the case, there was an incident where they knocked over a tray she was carrying, and at one point sang a song called Girl Fight during karaoke, aimed at her to get under her skin. None of this, on its own, was the stuff of tragedy. It was the kind of cruel, circular high school feuding that thousands of teenagers go through and survive. The difference here is what it slowly turned into. The local police were not blind to it. Over roughly 6 months, officers in Pinellas Park spoke with Rachel Wade 6 separate times about public confrontations. 6 times. That number tells you how loud and constant the conflict had become long before anyone got hurt. The system saw the smoke. Nobody managed to put out the fire. And then there was the message. In late August 2008, Rachel left a voicemail on Sarah's phone. It was ugly and full of foul language, but buried inside the ranting was a clear and specific warning. In the message, Rachel told Sarah that she was going to come after her and end her life. She said it plainly. She left it on a phone, in a recording, in her own voice. Sarah did not delete it. For reasons she could not have understood at the time, she saved that voicemail and kept it for the next 8 months. That single decision, made by a frightened teenager who probably just wanted proof of what she was dealing with, would later become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. For a while, the feud simply continued, loud and exhausting and going nowhere. Then came the night of April 14th, 2009. That evening, Rachel was alone in her apartment, waiting for Josh Camacho to come by. He did not. He was somewhere else entirely. He was with Sarah, the two of them spending an ordinary night together, watching movies and playing video games. At some point, Rachel went outside to walk her dog, and by her own telling, she heard a car horn and heard Sarah shout something at her about staying away from her man. Whatever actually happened in that moment, it set the night in motion. Rachel called an old boyfriend named Javier Laboy, and he told her to come over to his house. Before she left, she went to her kitchen, opened a drawer, and took out a steak blade. She brought it with her. Around 11 o'clock, Rachel made her way toward Camacho's house. He and Sarah were inside. There was a tense back and forth between Rachel and Josh by text. She told him she finally understood why he had gone quiet on her. He told her, bluntly, that he did not want her around anymore and that she should go home. She refused. She told him she would wait for Sarah to leave. Witnesses would later say they overheard Rachel making threats out loud on speakerphone, naming both Sarah and Josh. Just before midnight, the night took its final turn. Josh's sister Janet asked Sarah for a ride to a nearby McDonald's. While they were out, Sarah ran into a friend at a stop sign who told her that Rachel was over at Javier Laboy's house. That was the moment Sarah made the choice that cost her everything. Instead of going home, she decided to drive over and confront Rachel face to face. She was behind the wheel of her parents' minivan. While she was on her way, Rachel called her phone and repeated the threat. Sarah pulled up to the house and stopped the minivan hard, its front end just about 5 feet from Rachel's red Saturn. Rachel was already outside, standing with Javier and another friend named Dustin Grimes. As Sarah began to climb out of the minivan, the two of them came together. What happened next took only seconds. This is where the two versions of the story split, and it is the split a jury would eventually have to settle. Rachel's account, which she gave on the stand at her own trial, was that Sarah came at her, that the two of them fought and pulled each other's hair, and that she was hit in the head several times before she reacted. She insisted she had never gone looking for Sarah. She said the other girl had come to her. She framed what she did as self-protection in a fight she did not start. The witnesses told a different story. Josh Camacho, his sister, and Dustin Grimes testified that Rachel was the one who moved in, that she grabbed the blade and stepped toward the driver's side of the minivan, and that she struck Sarah twice in the chest. Sarah was unarmed. She had nothing in her hands. The wounds were to the center of her body, and she did not survive them. She was struck down right there, in a quiet residential neighborhood, over a boy who had told a courtroom he was not serious about either of them. The medical evidence later made plain how much force had been behind it. Sarah had been struck in the shoulder and the chest, and one of those blows reached her heart. The prosecutor, Wesley Dicus, would tell the jury that the attack had been so violent that the blade itself was left bent, and in those first terrible minutes, mortally wounded and clutching her chest, Sarah did something that says everything about how young and how frightened she still was. She called Josh, the boy at the center of all of it, to tell him what had happened. He ran to her house to tell her father, and the two of them drove to the scene together. Sarah was rushed to Northside Hospital, but the injury was too severe, and she was pronounced gone there at 2:20 the following morning. What witnesses described of Rachel in those same minutes could not have been more different. By their account, she was strikingly calm, saying only that she was done, and prosecutors later told the jury that as Sarah lay dying, Rachel sat back and asked a Pinellas Park officer for a cigarette. In the moments after, Rachel threw the blade into a neighboring yard. She later explained that she did not want anyone else to pick it up. By then, it was already the early hours of April 15th, 2009. Two families were about to be destroyed, and a feud that had lived mostly on phones and computer screens had ended in the worst possible place. Rachel Wade was charged in Sarah's death. When the case went to trial in July 2010, it became something unusual for the time. The whole thing was carried live on television, on a court coverage program, and people across the country followed it closely. It had everything that pulls an audience in, and it had a real 18-year-old at the center of it who was never coming back. The trial itself moved fast. It lasted about 3 days. Rachel's defense attorney, Jay Hebert, leaned hard into the self-protection argument. He told the jury that Sarah was the one who came looking for trouble that night, that she and her friends had spent months tormenting his client, and that the fatal confrontation was something Sarah set in motion when she drove over to that house. He pointed to the taunting at the restaurant, the songs, the long history of harassment that ran in both directions. There was a specific legal shape to that defense. Hebert argued self-protection under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, the statute that lets a person use force without backing away if they reasonably fear for their safety. He told the jury that Sarah was the bigger of the two, that her friends outnumbered Rachel that night, and that Sarah had nearly run Rachel over when she slammed the minivan to a stop. On the stand, Rachel cried through much of her testimony, especially as she tried to explain why she had taken a kitchen blade to a friend's house in the first place, insisting it had only been for protection. There was also a genuine imbalance in the evidence that is worth being honest about. The feud had run in both directions for months, with ugly messages flying back and forth, but Rachel had never saved any of the things Sarah sent her. Sarah had saved Rachel's. So when the jury sat down to weigh the threats, they heard the venom from only one side of the rivalry, and that side was Rachel's. But the prosecution had something Rachel could not talk her way around. They had her own voice. They played the voicemail Sarah had saved 8 months earlier, the one where Rachel had calmly promised to end her life. It is one thing to claim, on the stand, that you acted out of fear in a chaotic fight. It is another thing entirely when the jury can sit and listen to you describing exactly what you were going to do, recorded months before you did it. That recording reframed everything. It made the events of that night look less like panic and more like a promise being kept. The jury was made up of 5 men and 1 woman. They did not need long. After roughly 2.5 hours, they came back and found Rachel Wade guilty of second-degree homicide for Sarah's death. The self-protection story had not held. Sentencing came on September 3rd, 2010. The judge was Joseph Bellone, and he did not hide what he thought had happened. He acknowledged the things working in Rachel's favour. She was young. She had no prior record. Those facts were real, and he weighed them. But he also said plainly that what happened to Sarah was no accident, and that he believed Rachel had meant to take her life. The minimum the law allowed for the conviction was about 20.5 years. He went past it. He sentenced her to 27 years in state prison. Rachel did not accept the verdict quietly. She has continued to insist that she acted in self-protection, and she appealed her conviction, but those appeals failed and the sentence held. Today she is held at the Florida Women's Reception Center in Ocala, and according to her inmate records, her earliest possible release is in 2032, which would put her in her early 40s, having spent well over half her life behind bars. Joshua Camacho, the young man all of it had supposedly been about, faced no charges. After the case drew a wave of media attention, his parents sent him out of state to live with a relative in New York. He has reportedly drifted back to Florida in the years since, and by some accounts reconnected with Erin Slothauer, the mother of his child. In all the time that has passed, the only occasion he is known to have spoken publicly about any of it was when he was made to take the stand and testify. What stays with people about this case is not how complicated it was. It is how small the cause was compared to the size of the loss. 2 intelligent young women, both with futures in front of them, spent the better part of a year locked in a fight over a young man who would later shrug from a witness stand and suggest neither of them had truly been his. One of them is gone. The other will spend most of her young adulthood behind bars. The families on both sides were left to carry something that no apology and no sentence could ever set right. In the years since, the story has been retold in documentary series and even a television film, which means strangers will keep meeting Sarah Ludeman as a cautionary tale rather than as the veterinarian she wanted to be. There is a reason this particular case struck such a nerve at the time and is still pulled apart in documentaries and classrooms today. It landed right at the dawn of the social media age, when a generation of teenagers first had the tools to carry a feud everywhere they went. The fight between Rachel and Sarah did not stay at school or fade overnight the way schoolyard grudges once did. It lived on MySpace pages and in voicemails and text threads, refreshed and re-inflamed every few hours, with an audience of friends egging both sides on. By the time the two of them stood in that street, months of that constant, grinding, screen-fed hostility sat behind them. The technology did not create the jealousy, but it gave the jealousy nowhere to cool down. The voicemail is the detail that lingers, a threat spoken out loud, saved on a phone, almost forgotten, and then played back into a silent courtroom to a girl who never thought her own words would be the thing that defined the rest of her life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rachel Wade let her anger live on a recording. The next young woman did the opposite. She kept her plan almost entirely to herself, said little, showed less, and that quiet is exactly what made her so difficult for the people around her to read, until it was far too late. Section 2. The Girl Who Showed Nothing. Adrienne Reynolds was the new girl, and she was trying her best to be liked. She was 16, and she had just moved to the Quad Cities area of Illinois from Texas, only about 2 months before the winter of 2005. A new state, a new school in East Moline, a whole new set of faces to win over. Anyone who has ever switched schools as a teenager knows how that feels. The way you study a room and try to figure out where you fit and who is safe. Adrienne wanted friends. She had a job at a fast food place called Checkers. She had a family who loved her, and she had the ordinary hopes of a 16-year-old who was still mostly a stranger in her own town. The people who knew her said she was just trying to settle in. The tragedy, as one set of prosecutors would later put it, was that she picked the wrong person to get close to. That person was Sarah Kolb. Sarah was also 16, from the nearby town of Milan, Illinois. If Rachel Wade in our first story was loud, public, and impossible to miss, Sarah was the opposite kind of teenager, and that difference is the whole reason she belongs in this video. She did not flood anyone's phone with screaming messages. She did not put her rage on display for the neighborhood to hear. People around her described someone controlled, someone who kept her feelings tucked away where you could not see them. The thing that should have warned everyone was not shouted out loud. It was written down quietly, in private, in her own notebook. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand the tangle the three of them were caught in. Sarah was close with a boy named Corey Gregory, who at the time was around 17. He had been her boyfriend before, and the two of them stayed wrapped up in each other's lives even after. Adrienne, being new and friendly and 16, started spending time with the same circle of kids, and, by the prosecution's account, she became friendly with the boys Sarah cared about, including Corey. To Sarah, that was not a small thing. It built into something darker and more personal than simple dislike. She came to see Adrienne not as a lonely new classmate, but as a threat, someone moving in on a world Sarah thought of as hers. This is where the contrast with the first story sharpens. Rachel Wade left her threat on a recording for the whole world to find. Sarah Kolb left hers on a page. According to evidence used at her trials, on the day of the killing, Sarah wrote a journal entry that named Adrienne directly and said, in crude terms, that she was going to end her life. She wrote it down before it happened. That single page would later become one of the most damaging things the state had against her, because it showed the thought arriving on paper hours before it arrived in the real world. January 21st, 2005, was a winter afternoon, and it started with something completely normal: lunch. Adrienne went to meet Sarah, Corey, and another friend named Sean McKittrick at a Taco Bell in Moline. It was supposed to be teenagers grabbing fast food. Inside the group, though, the tension between the two girls boiled over into a heated argument. When Sean tried to step in and calm things down, Sarah told him to leave. He did. And once he was gone, the people who could have witnessed and maybe stopped what came next were gone too. The argument moved into Sarah's car, and there it turned physical. By the account prosecutors laid out and the courts accepted, Sarah and Corey held Adrienne down in the back of the vehicle, with Corey restraining her arms, and Adrienne lost her life there in the parking lot. The court later heard that a belt had been used. It happened fast, in daylight, in a public lot where people were coming and going to get lunch, just feet away from an ordinary fast food restaurant. What the two of them did afterward is the part of this story that is hardest to talk about, and I'm going to be honest about it without dragging anyone through every detail. They did not call for help. They did not panic and confess. They set about hiding what they had done. They drove Adrienne's remains out to a farm that belonged to Sarah's family in Mercer County and tried to destroy the remains by fire. That did not work, so they brought in another 16-year-old, a friend named Nathan Gaudette, and the three of them separated the remains and scattered them. Some were left at the family farm. Others were hidden at the Black Hawk State Historic Site in Rock Island. 3 teenagers, all 16 and 17, spent the hours after a classmate's life ended trying to make sure no one would ever find her. For a few days, it almost held. Then the ordinary machinery of normal life gave them away. Adrienne did not show up for her shift at Checkers. People who care about a teenager notice when she vanishes, and she was reported missing. When investigators started pulling the thread, they learned that the last people seen with her were Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory. The two were brought in for questioning. Corey broke. He confessed, and on January 26, 2005, he led law enforcement to where Adrienne had been hidden. 5 days after a normal lunch, the search for a missing girl had become something far worse. 11 days after that lunch, on February 1st, 2005, both Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory were charged with first-degree homicide and with concealment of a homicide. Both of them entered pleas of not guilty. From the very start, each side of this case would be shaped by one core fight. The same fight that runs through a lot of cases where more than one young person is involved. Who did the most? Who decided this? Corey would spend years insisting the worst of it came down to Sarah. Sarah's defense would point the finger right back at Corey. The courts, in the end, did not let either of them off the hook. Sarah Kolb went to trial first, and her trial began, fittingly enough for a story this grim, on Halloween, October 31st, 2005, at the county courthouse in Rock Island. It ran for about 2 weeks. The prosecution did not rely on a single dramatic moment. They built a wall of it. They called more than 50 witnesses. One was a man who had simply been walking into that Taco Bell and ended up a witness to a teenager's last day. Another was Nathan Gourdet, the friend who had helped hide the remains and who now sat in a courtroom describing it. And then there was the journal, Sarah's own handwriting, the entry naming Adrienne and stating plainly what Sarah intended to do. Even with all of that, the first trial did not end in a verdict. The jury went back to deliberate and stayed locked for around 15 hours. They could not all agree. The split, by reporting at the time, was 11 jurors leaning toward finding her guilty and 1 holding out. 11-1 is not a verdict. It is a hung jury, and it forced a mistrial. The whole thing had to be done over. Because the case had drawn so much attention in the area, the retrial was moved roughly 60 miles away to Dixon in hopes of finding jurors who had not already made up their minds. This time, the outcome was different. In February 2006, the jury found Sarah Kolb guilty on all counts. There would be no third chance to argue it. Corey Gregory did not gamble on a jury at all. He pleaded guilty to everything he was charged with. On July 10, 2006, he was given 40 years for the killing and another 5 years for concealment, a total of 45 years. Nathan Gourdet, the third teenager, was treated as a juvenile for his role in hiding the remains. He pleaded guilty and received a 5-year sentence. He served close to 4 years and was released in November 2008. His own story ended young too. In April 2012, at the age of 23, he lost his life in an automobile crash in Indiana. The moment that says the most about Sarah Kolb came at her sentencing in the summer of 2006. By then, she was 18. She stood in front of the court to learn how much of her life she was going to lose, and according to the reporters in the room, she showed no emotion at all. No tears, no reaction. The same stillness people had noticed in her all along held right to the end. The prosecutor, State's Attorney Jeff Terronez, did not soften his language. He argued that what happened to Adrienne was cold and calculated, and he called it pure evil, made worse, he said, by the fact that it was done by teenagers. The judge agreed that Sarah had been the aggressor, the one who carried a real desire for revenge and acted on it against Adrienne. He said he believed she was a danger to other people, especially when she got worked up, and he pointed straight at that journal entry, the threat she had written by her own hand the day it happened. He sentenced her to 48 years for the killing and 5 more years for concealment, to be served one after the other. 53 years in total. She was sent to the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she remains. The years since have been a long string of appeals and petitions. Sarah has asked for clemency and has tried more than once to have her sentence reduced, and as recently as late 2025, an Illinois appeals court affirmed the sentence she was given. Corey Gregory's case took a different legal path. A 2019 Illinois Supreme Court ruling held that very long sentences for offenders who were minors can amount to a life sentence in disguise, which opened the door to resentencing hearings. Corey, who transitioned while in prison and now goes by Harley Quinn and uses she and her, has been back before the courts more than once over that question, though the 45-year term has so far held. Through all of it, the two of them have kept blaming each other for the worst of what happened in that car. What lingers about Sarah Kolb is not a screaming voicemail or a public meltdown. It is the quiet, the flat, unreadable calm. She did not warn the world with noise. She made a note to herself, the way you might jot down a chore, and then she carried it out, and then she sat through a courtroom, learning her future without so much as a flinch. For Adrianne's family, that stillness has been its own kind of wound. 2 decades later, they still gather to remember a daughter who was 16, new in town, and just looking for somewhere to belong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A teenager who plans something terrible on paper is chilling enough, but there is a case that goes a step further than a notebook, into something almost impossible to comprehend. A young woman who, after ending the life of a girl she saw as a rival, kept a piece of her as a kind of keepsake, and who ended up facing the very harshest punishment her state was allowed to hand down. Section 3. The piece she kept. Colleen Slemmer had travelled a long way to start over. She was 19, originally from Florida, and she had come to Knoxville, Tennessee to join the Job Corps. For anyone who does not know it, Job Corps is a federal program that takes in young people, often kids from hard or unstable backgrounds, and tries to give them job skills and a fresh start. That is what Colleen was after, a fresh start. Her mother, May Martinez, was back in Florida, and Colleen was up in Tennessee trying to build something for herself among a group of other young people all chasing the same thing. The center she lived at was on Dale Avenue, and the residents there ate together, studied together, and got tangled up in each other's lives, the way young people living side by side always do. One of those other residents was Krista Gale Pike. Pike was 18, just a year younger than Colleen, and she had landed at the same program from out of state. While she was there, she started dating another resident, a 17-year-old named Daryl Shipp. For Pike, that relationship became the center of everything, and it is where this story goes wrong. She got it into her head that Colleen Slemmer was trying to take Shipp away from her. The people who actually knew Colleen would later say there was nothing to it, that Colleen had no such designs on him at all. It did not matter what was true. What mattered was what Pike believed, and what she had decided to do about it. To understand how Pike ended up in that program at all, you have to look at where she came from, because her lawyers and the court records later filled in a childhood that helps explain the wreckage, even if it can never excuse it. Pike was born in West Virginia in the spring of 1976 to a teenage mother who, by later accounts, struggled with alcohol and was in no real position to raise a child. Krista was handed from relative to relative and from one of her mother's boyfriends to the next, never landing anywhere safe for long. Court filings from her appeals describe a young life shaped by physical abuse, neglect, and a constant turnover of the adults who were supposed to be caring for her. Those same filings describe childhood sexual victimization and repeated attempts to harm herself, beginning when she was still a small child. It is worth being fair here, because the record is not one-sided. Some of her own family members later questioned parts of what she said about her past and described her as someone who lied easily. What is not in dispute is that her early years were chaotic in nearly every direction. By her teens, the pattern had hardened. She moved from school to school, used drugs and alcohol, ran away from home, and eventually dropped out of high school altogether. In the 10th grade, she was placed in a juvenile facility, and it was there that she first heard about Job Corps. To her, it must have looked like a genuine way out. She enrolled at the Knoxville Center in late 1994, hoping to train for steady work in the medical field, the kind of ordinary future that had always sat just out of her reach. For a few months, that is exactly what it was. A chance. The chance did not last, and a large part of why was the relationship she formed there. To Darrell, Shipp came from his own troubled background. He had dropped out of school young and had spent time around gang activity, and his mother had pushed him toward Job Corps for the same reason a lot of families did, to get him onto a better path. According to filings from Pike's own defense, Shipp had spent time in a psychiatric facility before he ever arrived, and during their relationship, he physically abused her. The two of them bonded fast, and part of what they bonded over was a shared fascination with occult imagery and what was described at her trial as devil worship. How real any of that belief actually was is something even the experts later disagreed about. Several who reviewed the case came away convinced the satanic trappings were less a sincere faith than a kind of adolescent theatre. Two damaged kids borrowing the symbols of metal and horror to feel powerful and dangerous. Pike carried a 5-pointed star among her own markings. Whatever it meant to her, it would surface again that January night, carved into Colleen in the worst way imaginable. She did not keep that decision to herself the way Sarah Kolb did. She talked. In the days beforehand, by later accounts, she spoke about Colleen with open contempt and made it clear she thought the other girl needed to be taught a lesson. Then she made a plan, and she pulled 2 other people into it. One was her boyfriend Shipp. The other was an 18-year-old friend named Shadola Peterson, who would come along that night and serve as a lookout. The night was January 12th, 1995. The 4 of them signed out of the dormitory. To get Colleen to come along, Pike lied to her. She offered the ordinary bait of a bored teenage evening, the chance to get a video and to smoke, and she told Colleen she wanted to make peace between them. That last part is the cruelest detail. Colleen went because she was told the fighting was over. She thought she was going to settle things and move on. Before they left, Pike quietly took 2 sharp objects with her, the kind of tools nobody brings to make peace. They walked Colleen to a remote, wooded part of the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus, near an old, abandoned mill. It was dark and far from anyone who might see or hear. And once they were there, far from help, Pike and Shipp turned on her. What followed is genuinely hard to describe, and I am not going to walk you through every minute of it because no one needs that, and Colleen deserves better. The plain facts are these. It was not quick. Over a stretch of time, Colleen was beaten and badly hurt. At one point, they carved a symbol into her, a 5-pointed star. Pike used a heavy piece of broken pavement against her. Colleen Slemmer lost her life out there in the dark, 19 years old, a long way from her mother and from the future she had moved to Tennessee to chase. Shadola Peterson kept watch while it happened, and then Pike did something that, more than anything else, is why her name is still known 30 years later. Before she left, she took a piece of bone from Colleen as a keepsake. She did not hide it. She did not bury it with the rest. She kept it, and afterwards she showed it off. She talked about what had happened to other students at the center, almost like a story she was proud of, and she displayed the piece of bone she had taken. That is how she was caught. You cannot brag about something like this to a group of young people and expect every single one of them to stay silent. Word reached the authorities. 2 days after that night, on January 14th, 1995, Krista Pike was arrested. When police did come for her, Pike did not stay quiet. She gave up her right to remain silent and confessed in her own words. At first, she tried to make it sound smaller than it was, saying she had only wanted Colleen to leave her alone. But the rest of the evidence did not fit that version, and neither did her own earlier words. Court documents later showed that, in the time before that night, Pike had told a friend she wanted Colleen gone for good, saying she felt mean that day. That is not the language of someone who lashed out and lost control in one terrible moment. It is the language of someone who had already made up her mind, and the prosecution would lean hard on that difference, arguing the whole thing was planned and deliberate, rather than a fight that spun out of hand. When the case reached a Knox County courtroom in the spring of 1996, the evidence was overwhelming and the details were almost beyond belief. The jury convicted Pike of first-degree homicide and of conspiring to carry it out. Then came the sentencing decision, and the jury chose the most severe option the law allowed. Pike was given capital punishment, the ultimate sentence the state of Tennessee can impose. She was 18 when she did it, which made the sentence historic in a grim way. Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to that punishment anywhere in the United States in more than 2 decades. She is, to this day, the only woman on Tennessee's row for the condemned. And because the law later changed to forbid this sentence for anyone who was under 18 at the time of their crime, Pike stands as the last person in Tennessee ever sentenced to capital punishment for something done at the age of 18. She sits at the very edge of a line the country redrew right after her. That redrawing came in 2005, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that no one could face this punishment for a crime committed before turning 18. Pike had crossed that line by a matter of months. A defendant in her position today could not be sentenced this way. The 2 others did not face what she faced. To Darrell Shipp, because he was only 17 at the time, could not be given the ultimate sentence. A jury convicted him of first-degree homicide in 1997, and he was given a life term with a distant chance of parole. He has been in custody since January 1995. In the autumn of 2025, he finally reached his first parole hearing, and the board said no. One member described it as among the most horrifying cases he had ever encountered, and said the suffering Colleen endured was beyond what the conscience can absorb. Shipp, for his part, did not try to deny his role. He called his younger self foolish, said he had shown terrible judgment, and told the board he had never pretended otherwise. His next review is years away. Shadola Peterson, the lookout, made a different deal. She turned and testified for the state against Pike and Shipp, and for that cooperation she received probation rather than prison. You might expect a story this dark to settle down once everyone is sentenced. Pike's did not. In August 2001, while she was already condemned and locked up at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville, Pike attacked another woman she was housed with, a 33-year-old inmate named Patricia Jones. By the court's findings, Pike tried to end Jones's life using a shoelace around her neck. Jones survived. The 2 had been feuding, and Pike believed Jones had been informing on her. What makes the episode even more chilling is what came afterward. In phone calls to her mother that the prison recorded, Pike laughed about what she had done and said that if Jones came near her again, she would simply do it once more. In 2004, a jury convicted Pike of attempted first-degree homicide for that attack, and the court added another 25 years to a sentence she already could not outlive. There was also, years later, an attempted escape scheme that authorities tied to her, though she was not formally charged in it. Pike's lawyers have spent decades trying to pull her back from the ultimate sentence, and their arguments are worth understanding because they sit at the heart of every case in this video. They have asked the courts to set the sentence aside. They point to her age, 18, barely an adult, and to the way the law and the science around teenage brains have shifted since the 1990s. They argue she was never properly examined at trial and that she lives with serious mental illness, including conditions like bipolar disorder and the lasting effects of trauma, along with signs of brain damage that they say a jury in 1996 never got to weigh. They describe a childhood soaked in violence, abuse, and neglect. They argue, plainly, that if Pike were tried today for the same crime, she would not be sentenced the same way, and that her punishment is harsher than that handed to women who took more than one life and received only prison terms. Her attorneys also say that, in the long years since, she has come to feel deep remorse for what she did. The courts, so far, have not been moved. Appeal after appeal has failed. A federal court refused to commute her sentence back in 2016, and in 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court did the thing her side had been fighting against for almost 30 years. It set a date. As things stand, Pike's sentence is scheduled to be carried out on September 30th, 2026. She is being held at a women's facility in Nashville and turned 50 in the spring of 2026. If the state goes through with it, she would become the first woman put to death by Tennessee in roughly 2 centuries. On the other side of all of it is May Martinez, Colleen's mother, who has now spent more than 30 years living with the loss of her daughter. She has opposed parole for Shipp. She has said she hopes to be present when Pike's sentence is finally carried out. 3 decades is a long time to carry that kind of grief, and she has carried it the whole way, from a courtroom in 1996 to parole hearings and execution dates in 2025 and 2026, while the legal system argues, very slowly, about exactly how responsible a frightened, damaged 18-year-old should be held for the worst thing a person can do. The hardest part of looking at Pike honestly is that both of the stories people tell about her have real evidence behind them. On one side is the reading that she is simply dangerous, the boasting afterward, the way she kept a piece of Colleen as a trophy and showed it off rather than hiding in horror, the near total absence of remorse in those first days, and then, years later, the attack on a fellow inmate and the escape scheme. All of it paints a picture of someone with a cold, even cruel streak that did not end with one night in the woods. On the other side is the reading her lawyers press, of a teenager whose mind had already been broken by abuse and instability long before she ever reached Knoxville, who fell under the sway of an older, abusive boyfriend and a borrowed fascination with darkness, and who, at 18, was nowhere near the finished adult the sentence treats her as. More recent reporting adds another layer still, noting that in the decades since, Pike has expressed remorse and turned toward religious and psychological support, which raises the oldest question in all of justice, whether who a person slowly becomes over 30 years should change what is owed for what they did in a single hour at 18. The case has never really left the public eye either. It has been turned into a true crime book and retold in television documentaries, often under lurid titles that lean into the satanic angle and flatten a damaged, jealous teenager into a cartoon of pure evil. That flattening is its own small injustice, because it makes the case far easier to file away and forget than it actually deserves to be. That tension is what makes Pike's case so hard. Almost no one disputes what she did. The facts were never really in doubt. The piece of bone she kept and showed off removed any question of confusion or accident. What people do argue about still is the deeper question underneath every story here. How much of this was a monster, and how much of it was a broken, jealous teenager whose mind had been wrecked long before that night in the woods? The law gave its answer. Whether that answer is right is something people will debate long after September 2026, one way or another. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases so far have all shared a single shape. One young woman at the centre, acting on her own jealousy, pulling in a helper or two. The next story breaks that mold completely, and it is somehow even harder to take in. It was not one teenager who decided someone had to suffer. It was a group of them, moving together as a pack, and the person whose life was lost that night was younger than anyone we have met so far, a girl of just 12. Section 4. The Pack. Shanda Shara was very young and she was happy. She was a bright, bubbly kid from the New Albany area of southern Indiana, the kind of young person who was just starting to figure out who she was. She had recently grown close to another girl from school, Amanda Hevrin, and the two of them had formed a close bond. For Shanda, it was new and exciting, a first taste of feeling understood and appreciated. Her parents, once they understood the situation, grew uneasy and eventually moved her to a different school. But Shanda was still just a child enjoying being liked, with no idea that her happiness had made her a target for someone she had barely met. That someone was Melinda Lovelace. Lovelace was older, and before Shanda ever came into the picture, she had been very close to Amanda Hevrin. The two of them had become close a couple of years earlier, and over time that connection fell apart. Then Amanda grew close to Shanda. To most people, that is just the ordinary churn of teenage romance, the kind of thing everyone lives through. To Melinda Lovelace, it became an obsession. She could not let it go. She decided that Shanda, a 12-year-old she hardly knew, was the reason she had lost Amanda, and she began to talk openly about wanting to hurt her. This was not a private grudge written in a notebook. As early as October 1991, at a school dance, Lovelace confronted Shanda directly and threatened her in front of people. Months before anything happened, she had already said out loud what was in her head. What sets this case apart from the others in this video is that Lovelace did not act alone. She did not just have one helper standing watch. She gathered a group. The night of January 10th, 1992, 4 teenagers ended up in one car. Melinda Lovelace, 16, her friend Laurie Tackett, 17, who was behind the wheel, and 2 younger girls, both 15, named Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence. The plan that Lovelace built relied on a lie that only a child would fall for, and that was the point. They knew Shanda trusted Amanda, so Hope and Toni, the 2 15-year-olds, went up to the door of the house where Shanda was staying the weekend with her father, and they told her they would take her to see Amanda. Shanda wanted to go. She asked them to come back later, once her dad was asleep, so she would not get in trouble. They did, and when they returned, Shanda quietly slipped out of the house and climbed into the car, believing she was being driven to meet the girl she cared about. There was no meeting with Amanda. Hidden under a blanket in the back seat was Melinda Lovelace, and she had brought a blade with her. As the car pulled away, Lovelace rose up out of the back, pulled Shanda's head back, and put the blade to her throat. She demanded that Shanda tell her about Amanda, and warned her what would happen if she lied. Shanda was terrified. She promised she would stay away from Amanda. She begged them not to hurt her. She was 12, in a car full of older girls, miles from her father, and she did everything a frightened child could think to do. What happened over the next several hours is the part of this story I am going to handle carefully, because Shanda was a little girl, and because no decent person needs the details. The plain truth is enough. The group first drove her to an abandoned old building in the area that local teenagers called the Witch's Castle. According to the courts, at that first stop, they mostly frightened and taunted her, and she was still essentially unharmed when they left. It could have ended there. It did not. They moved her to another location, and from that point, the night turned into something monstrous. Over a span of hours, Shanda was beaten and badly hurt by Lovelace and Tackett. At one stretch, they believed she had already lost her life and put her in the trunk of the car. only to hear her still moving, and then they hurt her again. It went on for most of the night, and at the very end, in a rural part of Jefferson County, Indiana, the group set a fire. The authorities would later determine the most unbearable fact of the entire case, which is that Shanda was still alive when that fire was lit. Tony Lawrence, the least involved of the four, had stepped away before that final act. Shanda Sharer lost her life out in the cold Indiana countryside, 12 years old, hours after she had snuck out of her father's house, thinking she was going to see a friend. What the girls did next is almost as chilling as the crime, because of how normal it was. They stopped and got breakfast. After a night like that, they pulled into a fast food restaurant in the morning like nothing had happened. That detail, more than almost anything, tells you how detached at least some of them had become from the weight of what they had just done. On the morning of January 11th, 1992, two hunters out in that rural area came across Shanda's remains. The discovery set off an investigation, but in this case the police did not have to work very hard to find their answers, because the people responsible could not keep it inside. Melinda Lovelace, of all things, went looking for Amanda that same day and told her what she had done, even showing her proof. And the two youngest girls cracked under the weight of it. Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey, their consciences eating at them, told their parents that night, and the families went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Within about a day, all four girls were in custody. They had been sworn to secrecy among themselves, but a secret that size does not hold when half the people holding it are 15 and horrified by what they helped do. All four were charged as adults, which in Indiana meant they were facing the full weight of the system, including the possibility of the most severe penalty the state could impose. To take that possibility off the table, each of them eventually agreed to a plea. In December 1992, Melinda Lovelace pleaded guilty. So did the others. The deals they accepted spared them the ultimate sentence, but they did not let them walk away clean, and the sentences they received tracked closely with how much each girl had actually done. Melinda Lovelace, the one who built the plan and carried the most rage, was given 60 years. Laurie Tackett, who had driven the car and taken part in the worst of the night, also received 60 years. Hope Rippey, whose role the court treated as serious but lesser, was sentenced to 60 years with a portion suspended, and her sentence was later reduced on appeal to 35 years. Tony Lawrence, the 15-year-old who had cooperated almost immediately and had stepped away before the end, was convicted of criminal confinement rather than the killing itself, and was sentenced to 20 years. None of the four is in prison today. Over the years, one by one, they each finished their time or earned release. Tony Lawrence, with the shortest sentence and the most cooperation, was paroled in 2000 after about 9 years. Hope Rippey came out in 2006. Laurie Tackett was released in 2018, having served more than 25 years, and Melinda Lovelace, the last of the four still behind bars, was released in September 2019, after more than 26 years in the Indiana Women's Prison. She went on to serve parole across the river in Kentucky. By some accounts, she has spent her years since release working with service animals trained to help people living with trauma and disabilities. That ending tends to sit badly with people, and it is worth being honest about why. The girl at the centre of this never got to grow up at all. Shanda Sharer would have turned 40 the same year Melinda Lovelace walked free. She never got to finish school, never got a first job, never got the ordinary adult life that her killers, every one of them, eventually returned to. There is no version of these sentences that feels equal to what was done to a 12-year-old. The legal system weighed degrees of guilt, cooperation, and youth, and it produced an outcome that, by its own logic, was careful and proportional. To the people who loved Shanda, careful and proportional was never going to feel like justice. The case also forces a harder question than any of the others so far, and it is the question of the group. With Rachel Wade, with Sarah Kolb, with Krista Pike, there was a clear centre, one young woman whose jealousy drove everything. Here there were four, and only one of them, Loveless, actually had a reason to want Shanda gone. The others had no quarrel with her at all. They did not know her. They had nothing to gain. And yet, pulled along by Loveless and by each other and by the strange momentum of a group where no one wanted to be the one to say stop, they helped take a child's life over a romance that had nothing to do with any of them. That is the dark thing this case reveals that the others do not. A single person with murder in her heart is terrifying. A group of ordinary teenagers who follow that person, step by step, past every point where any one of them could have walked away or made a phone call, is something arguably worse, because it shows how easily cruelty spreads when no one is willing to break from the pack. It is the reason this story has never faded in the more than 30 years since it happened. It is taught, written about, and retold, not because of the gory details, but because of how unbelievable the math is. 4 girls, one 12-year-old, a grudge that belonged to only one of them, and a night that none of them stopped. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 4 girls in that car acted together, and what they did was impossible to mistake for anything but cruelty. The next case is the opposite kind of puzzle. One young woman, alone at the wheel of an ordinary car on an ordinary road, and a single question that a courtroom would spend days trying to answer, which is whether the terrible thing that happened was a tragic accident or something she chose to do on purpose. Section 5. No Breaks. Mackenzie Sharilla was 17, and on paper she was the last person you would expect to end up in this video. She was a teenager from Strongsville, Ohio, a quiet suburb of Cleveland. She had grown up with her parents, Natalie and Steve, in an ordinary middle-class life. She had a boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Dominic Russo, and the two of them were part of a normal circle of young people who went to parties and hung out at each other's houses. There was nothing about her that looked like the young women we have met so far. No public threats screamed into a phone, no notebook full of menace, no group plotting in the dark. What makes her case so unsettling is exactly that. The thing she was eventually convicted of did not look like a crime at all when it happened. It looked like a tragedy. The early morning of July 31st, 2022 started the way a lot of summer nights end for teenagers. Mackenzie, Dominic, and a 19-year-old friend of his named Davion Flanagan had been out together. They had been to a graduation party, then ended up at a friend's house, and they did not leave until somewhere around 5:30 in the morning. 3 young people in a car at dawn, heading home after a long night. It is the most ordinary picture in the world. What the cameras in that business park captured next was anything but ordinary. A little after 5:30 a.m., a security camera picked up Mackenzie's 2018 Toyota Camry, turning, slowly and normally, onto a street called Progress Drive. There was nothing strange about how she was driving in that moment. She looked, by every account, like a careful driver. Then, within about a minute, a second camera caught what happened on that dead-end stretch of road. The Camry came flying down it at over 100 miles an hour and drove straight into the brick wall of a building called the Plidco Building at the corner of Progress Drive and Alameda Drive. There was no swerve, no correction. The car simply went, full speed, into a wall. Nobody found them right away. The crash happened in an empty industrial area at dawn, with almost no one around, and it was roughly 45 minutes before a passerby noticed the wreckage and called for help. When police arrived, they found the Camry crushed, its airbags spent, and all 3 young people trapped inside, unconscious and not breathing. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan could not be saved. Both were pronounced gone at the scene. Mackenzie, somehow, survived. She was seriously hurt and rushed to a hospital, but she lived. At first, this was simply a horrible accident. That is how it was treated. A young driver, a high-speed wreck, 2 lives lost, a community in mourning. There was no obvious reason to think anything else. But as investigators looked closer, the story they thought they were telling started to change. And the thing that changed it was the car itself. Modern cars carry a kind of black box, an event data recorder that quietly logs what the vehicle was doing in the moments before a crash. When investigators pulled the data from Mackenzie's Camry, what it showed stopped them cold. In the seconds before the impact, the accelerator had been pressed all the way down, as far as it would go. And the brake had never been touched. Not tapped, not pumped, nothing. There were no skid marks on the road behind the car, because she never tried to stop. A driver who falls asleep drifts. A driver who panics brakes. This car had been driven flat out in a straight line into a wall with no attempt to slow down at all. That single piece of evidence turned a tragedy into an investigation. In November 2022, a few months after the crash, Mackenzie Sharilla was arrested and charged in connection with the deaths of her boyfriend and his friend. When the case went to trial in the summer of 2023, it took an unusual form. Mackenzie chose to have her case decided not by a jury, but by a single judge in what is called a bench trial. The judge was Nancy Margaret Russo of the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court, who, despite the shared last name, was no relation to the victim, Dominic Russo. For days she heard the 2 competing stories of what happened on Progress Drive, and they could not have been further apart. The prosecution argued that this was no accident at all, that Mackenzie had driven into that building on purpose, meaning to end her own life and the lives of the 2 young men with her. To explain why, they pointed to her relationship with Dominic, which they described as deeply troubled and at times threatening. They told the court that just 2 weeks before the crash, during an argument while she was driving with Dominic in the car, she had threatened to crash the vehicle right then and there. According to what prosecutors laid out, Dominic was rattled enough that he called his mother to come get him, and in the end, a friend picked him up, and during a phone call, that friend supposedly overheard Mackenzie say she would crash the car that very moment. The prosecution's theory was that the crash was her way of ending the relationship for good, by ending all of them. The defense told a completely different story, and it is important to be fair to it, because plenty of people still believe it. Mackenzie's side argued that this was a genuine accident and nothing more. Witnesses testified that she and Dominic were, in fact, in a loving relationship. The defense also raised the possibility of a medical explanation, telling the court that Mackenzie suffered from a condition that can cause dizziness, which could account for a young driver losing control. In their telling, there was no plot and no motive, just a catastrophic accident that destroyed 3 families, one of whom was now being punished for surviving it. Mackenzie did not take the stand to testify in her own defense. In the end, the judge sided entirely with the prosecution. On August 14, 2023, Judge Russo found Mackenzie Sharilla guilty on all 12 counts against her, including the counts of intentionally causing the deaths of both young men and the counts of aggravated vehicular homicide. The words the judge used in delivering that verdict became some of the most quoted of the whole case. She said plainly that this was not careless driving, that it was a deliberate act meant to take lives. She said Mackenzie had changed, on that camera footage, from a responsible driver into something far more dangerous as she went down the street, and that she had a mission and carried it out with precision. The judge pointed to the small details that, taken together, she found impossible to explain as an accident. The crash happened at an hour when almost no one would be around to witness it. The route Mackenzie took was not one she normally drove, but it was one she had visited just days before. To the judge, none of that looked like chance. It looked planned. A week later, on August 21, 2023, Mackenzie returned to be sentenced. By then, she was 19. Before the sentence was read, she spoke to the court. She said she was sorry, and she told everyone that she had loved both Dominic and Davian. Then the judge handed down 2 sentences of 15 years to life, to be served at the same time, which means Mackenzie will have to spend at least 15 years behind bars before she can even ask to be considered for release. She was sent to the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she remains. Her case did not end there because she appealed. Her lawyers argued the evidence was not strong enough to support a finding that she did it on purpose. In September 2024, the 8th District Court of Appeals rejected that argument and upheld her conviction. The court found that the evidence supporting the verdict was sufficient and that the conclusion the judge reached was not against the weight of that evidence. The conviction stood. And yet, even with the courts having spoken clearly, this is the one case in this video where ordinary people still genuinely argue about what really happened. It became a national talking point, the subject of long online debates and more than one documentary, including a recent one on Netflix. The reason is simple. Unlike the other stories here, there was no confession, no notebook, no group of frightened accomplices to come forward, no piece of evidence that closed the question beyond all doubt. There was a car, a wall, a black box, and a relationship that the 2 sides described in completely opposite terms. The judge looked at all of it and concluded it was intentional. Mackenzie and the people who believe her insist to this day that it was a horrible accident. That uncertainty is exactly what makes the case so haunting, and it is worth sitting with honestly rather than pretending it away. If the courts are right, then Mackenzie Shirilla did something almost incomprehensible, using a thing as everyday as a car to take 2 people she claimed to love. If the courts are wrong, then a grieving teenager who survived a real accident is spending her life in prison for it. The evidence about the accelerator and the brakes is hard to argue with, and it is the reason a judge and an appeals court both reached the same conclusion. But the absence of a clear, proven reason why a seemingly normal girl would do this leaves a hole in the middle of the story that no verdict has ever fully filled. What is not in doubt is the cost. 2 young men, 20 and 19, with their whole lives in front of them, were gone in a few seconds on a quiet road at dawn. Their families have had to live with that loss, while also living with the strange, public, endlessly debated nature of how it happened. There is no documentary or online thread that gives them their sons back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mackenzie Shirilla, if the courts have it right, used her own hands and her own car to do what she did. The next young woman never touched the person who lost their life. She did something colder in its own way. She found someone who would do anything for her, someone who would carry out the terrible part so she would not have to. And then, she simply let him. Section 6. The Puppet Master. Stephanie Rengel was 14 and she lost her life over a grudge held by a girl she had never once met. She was a kid from East York, a part of Toronto, Canada. 14 years old, in the middle of the most ordinary stretch of growing up there is. New Year's Day of 2008 should have been nothing more than the first lazy morning of a fresh year for her. Instead, it became the day her family's life broke apart, and the reason it happened is one of the strangest and most unsettling in this entire video. Stephanie did not die because of something she did. She did not die in a fight, or a feud, or a confrontation. She died because somewhere across the city, another teenage girl had decided she should. And that girl had spent months turning a boy into the weapon to make it happen. That girl was Melissa Todorovich. Melissa was 15. She had a boyfriend, a 17-year-old named David Bagshaw, and on the surface they were just another teenage couple. But Melissa had learned something about David's past that she could not let go of. 2 years earlier, when they were all younger, David had briefly dated Stephanie Rengel. It had been short, and it was long over. To almost anyone it would have been a non-issue, the kind of old history every teenager carries. To Melissa, it became an obsession that grew darker by the week. She convinced herself that Stephanie was a rival, a threat to her hold on David, and she came to believe the younger girl was spreading rumors about her. None of it was based on much. Melissa and Stephanie had never spoken. They had never been in the same room. Melissa built an entire campaign of hatred around a person she knew only as an idea. What she did with that hatred is the thing that makes her case different from every other one so far. Melissa never picked up a weapon. She never went near Stephanie. She never had to. Instead, she went to work on the one person she could control, the boy who was in love with her, and she set out to bend him until he would do the unthinkable on her behalf. For months, she pressured him. The court would later see reams of messages between the two of them, and they laid out the campaign in chilling detail. Melissa told David again and again that he had to end Stephanie's life. When he hesitated, she squeezed harder. She threatened to break up with him. She dangled the relationship itself as the prize, telling him she would cut off all affection and leave him for good unless he did what she wanted. She used the thing a besotted teenage boy wanted most as the lever to get the thing she wanted most. The Crown, the prosecution in the case, would later describe her with a single phrase that stuck to her permanently. They called her the puppet master, and the messages showed exactly why. David Bagshaw was no innocent in this. He made his own choices, and the law would hold him fully responsible for them. But he was also, by every account, a young man who had been worked on relentlessly by someone he could not say no to, and eventually he gave in. He agreed to do what Melissa had been demanding. On New Year's Day, January 1st, 2008, he went to Stephanie Rengel's home in East York. He drew her outside, and there, on a city street, he attacked her, hurting her 6 times with a blade and leaving her in the snow where she lost her life. She was 14 years old. She had no idea who he really was working for, no idea that her quiet street and her ordinary morning had been chosen for her months in advance by a girl she had never met. Melissa was not there. She did not need to be. But she was not a passive bystander either, and what she did that night removed any doubt about her role. She knew David was going to Stephanie's house to do it. She knew the plan, and about 15 minutes after it was over, she called him, and she asked him, plainly, whether the girl was dead. She also told police later that she had asked him to come to her house afterward so he could show her how he had done it. This was not a girl who had made an offhand comment that a boyfriend took too far. This was someone tracking the outcome of a plan she had built, checking that it had worked. In the end, it was Melissa's own words that undid her. When police questioned her after Stephanie's death, she said something remarkable. She told them that the whole thing had been more her idea than David's, though she added that she had not really believed he would take her seriously and actually go through with it. Those statements, her own admissions on videotape, became central to the case against her, and they led to her arrest. She had spent months convincing a boy to do something terrible, and then, talking to police, she could not quite stop herself from claiming the credit. Both teenagers were charged. Because they were so young, Canadian law placed strict limits on what could be made public. Throughout the proceedings, Melissa could not be named at all and was referred to only by her initials, as was David, who was known publicly only as DB. That protection is built into the country's youth justice system, and it shaped how the case was reported for a long time. David Bagshaw pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Melissa Todorovich went to trial, and in 2009 she too was convicted of first-degree homicide, found responsible for orchestrating the killing even though she had never laid a hand on the victim. Then came the question that would decide the rest of her life. Both teenagers were so young that they could have been sentenced as youths, with far shorter terms. The Crown asked instead that they be sentenced as adults. Justice Ian Nordheimer agreed in Melissa's case. He sentenced her as an adult to life in prison, and because she was being treated as an adult, the law's shield finally dropped and her name became public for the first time. The girl the courts have called only by initials was Melissa Todorovich. Under the terms of that adult sentence, she would have to wait 7 years before she could even apply for parole. David Bagshaw received a life sentence as well. At her sentencing, the contrast in the courtroom was striking. The neat cardigans and tidy ponytail she had worn through the trial were gone. When the sentence came down, her family began to sob, and members of Stephanie's family cried quietly. And as Melissa was led away in handcuffs, her own eyes filled with tears. Whatever those tears were for, the girl whose life had been planned away was not coming back. Melissa did not accept the outcome. She appealed, arguing that the self-incriminating statement she had given police should never have been allowed as evidence because, she said, the police had not properly explained her rights as a young person before she spoke. It was a serious legal argument, and the courts took it seriously. But in 2014, the Ontario Court of Appeal rejected it and upheld both her conviction and her adult sentence. In doing so, the appeal court made an observation that says a great deal about who they believed she was. They noted that she had shown no empathy for Stephanie and that she harboured ongoing thoughts of hurting others. This was not, in their reading, a one-time lapse by a confused teenager. It was a window into something more lasting. The years since have only deepened that picture, and the place to see it most clearly is in her long, repeated encounters with the parole system. She was eventually moved to an adult prison as she grew older, and when she became eligible to seek her freedom, the Parole Board of Canada kept finding the same problem. At one point, she was granted day parole and short absences, only to have the day parole revoked. The reason was telling. While out, she had failed to disclose that she had become involved in what was described as an unhealthy situation with 2 former convicts, and that she was playing them against each other. The very trait that had defined her crime, the talent for manipulating people, had surfaced again the moment she had a little freedom. In 2020, the board denied her full parole, stating bluntly that she was unwilling or unable to address her capacity for deceit and manipulation, and that those issues had to be dealt with before she could be considered safe. As recently as 2024, she was granted a limited set of short absences to a halfway house, still inching through a system that has never fully trusted her. By then, she was in her early 30s, a long way from the 15-year-old who had sent those messages, and yet the board's concerns had barely changed. What lingers about this case is how cold and how distant Melissa managed to stay from her own crime. The others in this video, for all their cruelty, were present for what they did. They were there in the car, in the woods, behind the wheel. Melissa arranged for a 14-year-old to lose her life, and then waited at home for a phone call to confirm it had worked. She used a human being who loved her as a tool, knowing that if anything went wrong, it would be his hands that were marked, not hers. That she nearly got away with treating it that way, and only undid herself by talking, makes it more disturbing rather than less. And underneath the strategy and the manipulation is a 14-year-old who never had a chance. Stephanie Rengel did nothing to invite any of this. She was not in a feud. She was not anyone's rival in any real sense. She had simply, briefly, dated a boy years earlier, and that was enough to get her marked for death by a stranger. Her family has spent the years since attending parole hearings and reading board decisions, forced to relive the case every time Melissa makes another bid for freedom, while the girl at the centre of it stays frozen at 14, the age she will always be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Melissa Todorovich kept her own hands clean and let a boy carry her hatred out into the world for her. The next young woman did the opposite of hiding behind someone else. She had been the one pushed aside, the one told that it was over and that she was no longer wanted. And she decided that if she could not have the person she had set her heart on, then she would be the one to end the story, on her own terms and by her own hand. Section 7. He said it was over. Yakim Lolo was 17, and almost everyone who knew him used the word devoted to describe him. Friends and family called him Kamo. He was a junior at Miami Northwestern Senior High School in Florida, a football player, and, by his mother's account, a straight-A student who dreamed of building a career in finance one day. He loved the game, he loved video games, and most of all, the people closest to him said, he loved his family. He was the kind of 17-year-old who looked like he had a clear runway in front of him. He had a plan and the grades to back it up. 5 days before Christmas of 2024, all of that ended in the garage of his own apartment building, and the person responsible was his girlfriend. Her name is Jahara Malik, and she was also 17. To understand why this case sits in this video, you have to understand how unusual it is, and the section is going to be honest about that from the start. Nearly every story you will ever hear about a teenage relationship turning fatal follows the same grim shape. A boy cannot accept that a girl wants to leave him, and he hurts or ends her life because of it. We have already touched on that pattern, and the records are full of it. This case is the mirror image. Here it was the young man, Kamo, who, by his family's account, had decided he no longer wanted to be in the relationship, and it was the young woman who could not accept it. That reversal is rare enough that the case drew national attention, and it is also part of why it has been so hard for the people who loved him to make sense of. What happened took place on December 20th, 2024, in the Little Haiti area of Miami, near Northwest 6th Court and 61st Street. The two of them were at the apartment complex where Kamo lived. At some point, they ended up together in a garage area of the building, and there, Jahara used a blade on him. He was wounded badly, and he did not survive. A 17-year-old with a future mapped out lost his life a short walk from his own front door, days before a holiday his family had expected to spend with him. In the immediate aftermath, Jahara had an explanation ready, and it is the first thing that made investigators uneasy. She told police that what happened had been an accident. She described it as horseplay between the two of them, the kind of rough, joking around that couples sometimes do, that had gone terribly and unintentionally wrong. If that had been the whole story, this would be a tragedy, not a crime. A blade, a careless moment, a young person gone. It happens, and the law treats genuine accidents very differently from intentional acts. But the building had cameras, and the cameras told a story that did not match the one Jahara was telling. The surveillance footage captured the two of them in the moments around the attack. More than the images, it was the sound that mattered. On the audio, according to the Miami police sergeant who testified about it, Kamo can be heard pleading with Jahara by name, asking her not to do it. That is not the sound of horseplay. That is the sound of a young man who understood what was about to happen and was begging the person he was with to stop. Investigators also pointed to other evidence that cut against the accident story, including what prosecutors described as a history of earlier violent incidents involving Jahara, directed both at Kamo and at other people. Put together, the picture that emerged was not of a clumsy accident at all, but of something far more deliberate. As for why, the clearest account came from Kamo's own family. By his mother's telling, the argument that turned fatal that night had started after Kamo told Jahara that he no longer wanted to be in the relationship with her. In other words, the trigger was the breakup itself. He was ending things, and that ending is what the confrontation grew out of. It is important to be careful here, because the full inner story of that night was never laid out in a trial, and Jahara never publicly gave a detailed account beyond her early accident claim. But the rejection, the simple fact of a teenage boy saying he was done, is the thread the people who knew him keep returning to when they try to explain the unexplainable. Because of the seriousness of what she was accused of, Jahara was charged as an adult, even though she was only 17 at the time. That is a significant step. It means the protections and shorter terms that usually apply to young offenders were set aside, and she faced the system the way an adult would. For a long stretch, she maintained her not guilty position, walking into court wearing a mask and a hoodie, surrounded by her family and her lawyers. Then, in March 2026, the case took a turn that would shape everything that followed. Jahara changed her plea. She pleaded guilty, and this is a detail that matters a great deal for being accurate about her case. She did not plead guilty to the most serious charge. She admitted to the lesser charge, the one that sits a step below the most serious level of unlawful killing, along with a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. And she did it without a negotiated deal. There was no agreement with prosecutors guaranteeing her a certain sentence in exchange for the plea. She simply admitted responsibility and placed her fate entirely in the hands of the judge, who would decide how many years she would serve. That decision, the plea to a lesser charge, became the center of a painful disagreement that has never fully settled. To Kamo's family, what happened was not a lesser anything. They believed it was an intentional act, and they wanted it treated as the most serious charge available. The lesser plea, in their eyes, undersold what had been done to their son, and let Jahara claim a kind of accident that the video and audio did not support. Some relatives were openly dissatisfied that the case resolved the way it did, feeling that it had been handled in a way that fell short of what Kamo deserved. The sentencing hearing, held on May 5, 2026, in a Miami-Dade courtroom before Judge Christine Hernandez, was about as raw as these proceedings get. The room was packed. Kamo's relatives and Jahara's relatives sat on opposite sides, and some of his loved ones had to step out of the room because the emotion became too much to bear. The knife that had been used was shown to the court. The surveillance video was played, and Jahara held back tears as the footage showed the moments of the attack she had once called an accident. One after another, the people who loved Kamo stood and spoke. His aunt did not soften anything. She called Jahara a murderer to her face and used harsh words to describe her, saying she had been brought into the world to cause suffering and laying part of the blame on her upbringing. His father said he felt out of his element, but was determined to stand up and defend his son at every chance he got, and made clear he did not like the way the case had been handled. His mother said she wanted the maximum sentence, that her son had been taken for no reason, and that she did not believe Jahara was truly sorry, pointing to how long it had taken her to take any responsibility at all. Jahara spoke too. From the courtroom floor, she offered an apology to the family. She told them she had been wrong, and that she thought every single day about the damage she had caused. She called Kamo her best friend and her love, someone she could talk to about anything, and said she missed him every day. She said she wished she could go back and change what happened but could not, and that the not being able to undo it was the worst part. She acknowledged plainly that the family wanted her in prison. Her defense had, throughout the case, emphasized that she struggled with mental health issues and that context was part of what her side asked the court to weigh. In the end, Judge Hernandez settled on a sentence of 17 years in prison, followed by 5 years of reporting probation once she is released. She also ordered Jahara to undergo a mental health evaluation, and she added an unusual condition, one that says something about the nature of the case. Every year, on the anniversary of Kamo's death, Jahara is required to write a letter reflecting on what she did and on the harm her actions caused. Most sentences end at the prison gate. This one reaches forward across decades, forcing her to sit down once a year and put on paper an accounting of the life she ended. Whether that is a meaningful act of accountability or simply a yearly reminder of an unhealable wound depends entirely on who she becomes. It is worth pausing on what this case does and does not tell us, because it is genuinely less clear-cut than most of the others in this video, and pretending otherwise would not be honest. We do not have a confession laying out a motive. We do not have a notebook or a string of threatening messages like in the earlier stories. What we have is a girl who first said it was an accident, a video and an audio recording that strongly suggested it was not, a guilty plea to a charge below the most serious one, and a grieving family convinced that the system let their son down. The legal outcome was, in plain terms, an admission that she unlawfully caused his death, without a court ever formally declaring that she set out that night intending to do it. What is not in doubt is how the loss landed. A 17-year-old who had done everything right. The grades, the sport, the plans, the devotion to his family, was gone in a few minutes in a garage, and the recording of him asking the person he was with to stop is the kind of detail that does not leave you once you have heard it described. His family has been left not only with that loss, but with the added burden of feeling that the punishment did not match the crime, which is its own slow grief. This case also forces a fair point about the others in this video, and about how we think about all of it. Teenage dating violence is real, and it is common, and the overwhelming majority of the time, the person who ends up gone is a girl, and the person responsible is a boy who could not let her leave. That is the pattern the experts and the statistics describe again and again. The reason a case like Jahara Malik's stands out, the reason it became national news, is precisely that it ran the other way. A young woman told by a young man that he wanted out, responded with something that ended his life. The rarity of that direction does not make Kamo any less gone, or his family's pain any smaller. But it is part of why this story is included here. Because the truth this video keeps circling is that the impulse to control, to refuse the word no, to decide that if a relationship is going to end, then it will end on your terms, is not the property of any one gender. It is a human failure. And when it reaches a teenager holding a weapon, the result is the same no matter who is holding it. Jahara Malik will spend a large part of her young adulthood behind bars, and once a year, for as long as the court demands it, she will have to write down what she did. Kamo Lola will stay 17 forever, a straight-A student who wanted to work in finance and never got the chance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jahara Malik's case turned on a single, sudden, violent minute, and on the question of whether she truly meant it, a question a courtroom never fully answered. The next young woman left no room for that kind of doubt at all. There was nothing sudden or uncertain about what she did. She thought about it. She made a plan. She set a trap on a quiet piece of ground, and then she waited for the person she had marked to walk straight into it. Section 8. The Trap by the Trees. Tyler Myers was 22 years old when he accepted an invitation that he had no reason to think twice about. He lived in Salmon Arm, a small city in the interior of British Columbia, Canada. On an evening in late November of 2008, the 21st to be exact, a young woman he was seeing asked him to come meet her at the schoolyard of Bastion Elementary School. There was nothing alarming about that. He knew her. He was involved with her. A quiet schoolyard after dark is the kind of out-of-the-way spot people sometimes pick to be alone together, away from parents and prying eyes. So Tyler went. He walked onto that school ground expecting to meet someone he cared about. What was actually waiting for him was a carefully built trap, and he never returned home. The young woman who invited him there was Monika Sikorsky. To understand what she had set up, you have to understand the strange shape of her life that fall. Sikorsky was in her final year of high school, and she was maintaining close connections with two different people at the same time, neither fully aware of the other. One was Tyler. The other was a classmate of hers, a boy in her social circle who was, by all accounts, completely under her influence. And it was that classmate, not Sikorsky, who was hidden in the dark when Tyler arrived. The plan was cold and deliberate, the opposite of a moment that spirals out of control. Sikorsky had arranged for the 16-year-old to get hold of a rifle, which he borrowed from a friend, and to conceal himself in a stand of trees at the edge of the school grounds. When Tyler showed up, Sikorsky did not just leave him standing in the open. She walked with him, leading him toward the exact spot near the trees where she knew the young man was crouched and waiting. Then, the 16-year-old fired at Tyler from his hiding place. He hit him. And then, rather than stopping, he came out from the trees and fired twice more at the wounded man on the ground, including a final shot to the back of the head. According to what came out in court, that last shot was fired at Sikorski's urging. Tyler Myers lost his life there on the school grounds, 22 years old, brought to that spot by a teenager he trusted, and ended by another teenager hiding in the dark. Here is the part that makes this case different from almost every other one in this video, and it is the thing that has haunted everyone connected to it ever since. No one has ever been able to say with any confidence why. In the other stories, there is a reason, even if it is a terrible and disproportionate one. Jealousy over a boyfriend, a rivalry, a breakup, an obsession. With Monika Sikorski, the motive simply never came into focus. There was no clear feud with Tyler, no obvious thing he had done, no money, no revenge anyone could point to. The judge who eventually sentenced her, BC Supreme Court Justice Sherry Donegan, said as much in open court. She called the crime inexplicable. She pointed out that at the time of the offence, Sikorski had everything going for her, opportunities that many kids can only dream of, and that this was exactly what made what she did so impossible to understand. A teenage girl with a good life and a future arranged the ambush of a young man she was dating for reasons that have never been pinned down. That emptiness at the centre of the case is somehow more unsettling than any motive could be. In the immediate aftermath, this did not look like a case that would ever be solved. Tyler's body was found on a trail next to the elementary school, and for a long time the investigation went nowhere. It became a cold case. The two teenagers responsible were walking around free, finishing school, living their lives, and the people who loved Tyler had no answers at all. In a quiet community, a young man had lost his life, and no one was being held to account. What eventually cracked it open is one of the most remarkable parts of the whole story, and it is something Canadian investigators are specifically known for. In 2012, 4 years after Tyler's death, the National Police Force ran an elaborate undercover operation aimed squarely at Monika Sikorski. The technique they used is sometimes called a Mr. Big Sting. Officers posed as members of a powerful, glamorous criminal gang, the kind of organisation a certain kind of person finds thrilling. Slowly, over time, they pulled Sikorski into this fake world and made her believe she was being recruited into the gang. They gained her trust. And then, believing she was confiding in one of the gang's leaders, someone who would be impressed rather than horrified, Sikorski confessed to what she had done to Tyler. She did not stop there. She also named the 16-year-old as the one who had fired, and she even briefly introduced him to the undercover officers. The trap she had built 4 years earlier finally closed. Except this time, she was the one who walked into it. Both of them were arrested in 2012 and charged. The two cases then took different paths through the courts, and the difference matters. The young man who had fired the rifle went to trial. At the start of it, he admitted that he was the one who pulled the trigger, and he tried to plead guilty to the lesser level of the charge, 2nd degree. But the prosecution did not accept that. They pushed for the most serious charge, 1st degree, which in Canada is reserved for killings that are planned and deliberate. They argued, in essence, that this was not a panic or a mistake, but a planned act, and the court agreed. In June of 2016, he was found guilty of 1st-degree murder. At his trial, he offered an account meant to soften what he did, claiming he had only meant to frighten Tyler and that he panicked after the first shot and fired again. The court did not find that version persuasive enough to lower the charge. He was also described, by those examining the case, as someone almost addicted to Sikorski's attention, constantly chasing her affection, which is part of how she had been able to point him at another human being like a tool. Because he was 16 at the time, the law protects his identity, and he cannot be named. Monika Sikorski's case ended more abruptly. Her trial was supposed to last about a month, and on what was meant to be its very first day in November 2016, she stunned the courtroom by pleading guilty. She admitted to second-degree murder for her role in arranging Tyler's death. A few weeks later, on December 5, 2016, she was back in a Kamloops courtroom to be sentenced, and more than 50 people packed the small room to watch. The central question for the judge was whether to treat her as a youth with the shorter terms that come with that, or as an adult. The court chose to sentence her as an adult. That decision carried two consequences. The first was the sentence itself, a life term with no chance of full parole for 7 years. The second was that the publication ban, which had hidden her identity throughout because she had been a minor when it happened, was lifted. The young woman the public had only known about in vague terms suddenly had a name, and that name was Monica Sikorsky. At the sentencing, Sikorsky spoke. She told the court she was going forward with her plea to acknowledge what she had done, and she said that what happened in 2008 had changed everyone's lives. She said that no one ever deserved what happened to Tyler. She told his family she did not expect them to forgive her, and that she would always have to live with what she had done. The reactions from Tyler's family were not the same, and that split is its own quietly moving part of the story. The common-law spouse of Tyler's late father refused to accept the apology, calling it false and pointing out that Sikorsky could have come forward 2 days, 2 weeks, or 2 months after the killing and said she was sorry, and instead had stayed silent for years. That is a fair and human response. But Tyler's mother, Barbara Myers, saw it differently. She said she was satisfied with the apology and the outcome, and that what made an impression on her was that Sikorsky had addressed her personally and expressed what felt to her like real remorse. Remarkably, she said she had even hugged Sikorsky's mother before the hearing, and that she held no hard feelings towards Sikorsky's family, whom she called good people. In a story with this little explanation and this much loss, a grieving mother choosing grace toward the family of the person responsible is the kind of thing that stays with you. There is one more detail that lands strangely, given how little sense the rest of it makes. After Tyler's death, Sikorsky and the young man who had fired the rifle did not stay together. They split up a short time later, and Sikorsky went on to begin dating one of Tyler's own friends. Whatever was driving her, it was not a grand love that could not survive without Tyler gone. The whole thing was built and then simply abandoned, like she had moved on from a phase. The years since have followed the slow path of the Canadian parole system. Sikorsky was assessed as a low risk for future violence. She was granted day parole in 2021, allowing her to live in the community under supervision. In 2023, the Parole Board of Canada granted her full parole, noting that apart from one minor lapse, when she had some alcohol while out at dinner with a friend, she had behaved well. By early 2026, several of her remaining parole conditions had been eased or lifted entirely, with officials concluding they were no longer necessary. The judge, back in 2016, had predicted this, saying that despite how baffling her crime was, Sikorsky would likely go on to become a contributing member of society. She is now in her 30s, living a largely free life, while Tyler Myers stays 22 forever. What makes this case worth sitting with is precisely the thing that frustrated the court. There is no satisfying answer at the bottom of it. We are used to crimes that, however awful, at least make a grim kind of sense once you understand what the person wanted. Sikorsky seems to have wanted nothing in particular. She was not protecting a relationship because she let both of them go. She was not getting revenge for anything anyone can identify. She had a good life, options, a future, and she used a boy who was desperate for her approval to take the life of a man who came to a schoolyard because he thought she wanted to see him. The closest thing to an explanation that anyone has offered is the power itself. The cold thrill of being able to make another person do something monstrous simply because they could not say no to her. If that is the answer, it is a chilling one, because it means Tyler did not lose his life over love or hate or money. He lost it over a young woman's curiosity about what she could get people to do. And that points to the uncomfortable thread running through this entire video. Some of these young women acted out of jealousy, some out of rejection, some out of obsession. But underneath the different reasons sits the same thing: the willingness to treat another human life as a thing to be removed when it becomes inconvenient or interesting to remove it. Sokolsky just happened to be the clearest example of it, because she did it with the least reason of all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Monika Sokolsky's motive stayed a mystery right to the end, and the court was left guessing. The next young woman left no mystery at all about why she did it. The people she turned on were not a romantic rival, and they were not a partner who had left her. They were her own family, and the only thing they had done wrong, in her eyes, was try to keep her away from the person she had fallen for. Section 9. To be together. Carl and Sarah Collier were the kind of couple a neighborhood relies on without ever quite noticing. They lived in Fayetteville, a quiet, church-going community in North Fayette County, Georgia, not far from Atlanta. Carl was 74. He had spent most of his working life with Delta Airlines before moving on to painting houses. Sarah was 73, a homemaker. They went to church regularly. Decades earlier, they had adopted children, and they were known to everyone around them as hard-working, decent, generous people. In the spring of 2004, they took on one more responsibility, and it was the one that would cost them everything. They opened their home to their 15-year-old granddaughter, Holly Ann Harvey. Holly had not had a stable childhood. Her mother, Carla, had long struggled with drugs and trouble with the law, which meant Holly had bounced around for much of her life. In April of 2004, Carla was sent to prison on a drug conviction, and so Holly came to live full-time with her grandparents in their suburban home. She stayed in the basement. From the outside, it looked like a rescue. Two stable, loving grandparents giving a struggling teenager a safe place to land. And in their minds, that is exactly what they were trying to do. The trouble was that Holly did not want to be rescued, at least not on their terms. By that point, she was using drugs and having a hard time at school, and at the center of her world was a 16-year-old girlfriend named Sandra Ketchum, who went by Sandy. The Colliers, watching their granddaughter struggle, set down rules. They told her she had to stop using drugs, and they told her she had to stop seeing Sandy. To them, both rules came from the same place, a desire to pull her back from a path they believed was hurting her. To Holly, the rules felt like a cage. She did not hide how she felt. There was a poem she wrote, later found by investigators, in which she described how depressed she was and how she cried herself to sleep because her grandparents had ordered her to give up Sandy and give up the drugs. That same poem also contained a line about wanting to end a life. A lieutenant with the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, Bruce Jordan, was among those who later read it. Around the house, Holly grew openly hostile. She told her grandparents she hated them, she became aggressive with them, and the Colliers, by every account, simply could not believe their granddaughter was capable of anything truly dangerous. They kept loving her, kept trying, kept trusting that things would work out. On Wednesday, August 2nd, 2004, Holly broke their rules in the most direct way she could. She snuck Sandy into the house to spend the night with her in the basement bedroom. The two girls stayed up listening to music and smoking marijuana, and at some point that long night and into the next morning, they stopped being two teenagers hiding from the adults upstairs and became something far worse. They decided that the grandparents had to go. The plan they built was deliberate and cold. Holly went to the kitchen and gathered blades, choosing the largest she could find. To be sure it was sharp enough, the girls tested it. Then they came up with a way to draw the grandparents down to them. They knew the smell of marijuana would bring the Colliers to investigate, so they used it as bait. Sandy hid herself in the basement bedroom, out of sight, and they waited. Sarah Collier came down first. When she entered the room, Holly pulled out a blade she had concealed and attacked her grandmother. Sarah screamed. Upstairs, Carl heard it and came down, and when he saw what was happening, he fought. He punched Holly in the face. He tried to pin his granddaughter down and very nearly stopped her. But Holly wounded him in the chest, and she called for Sandy to help. Carl, badly hurt, broke away and tried to get back up the stairs toward a phone, terrified he would not reach it in time. Holly handed Sandy the blade and chased her grandfather up into the kitchen, afraid he would call for help. While that was happening upstairs, Sandy continued the attack on Sarah down in the basement. By the time it was over, both Carl and Sarah Collier had lost their lives, each of them wounded many times over, in the home where they had taken their granddaughter in only months before. What the girls did next removed any doubt about how planned it all was. When Holly was later arrested, police found a short list written in ink on her own arm. It was a to-do list, and it laid out the steps in plain order. End the grandparents, take the keys, take the money, take the jewelry. They carried it out almost exactly as written, taking the Colliers' vehicle and their valuables and driving away. The grandparents were not found right away by strangers. That evening, the Colliers' son, Kevin, got a call from a family friend and went down to his parents' house, where he walked into a scene no son should ever see. His parents were gone, and their vehicle was missing. Kevin knew immediately who the police should be looking for, and he told them about Holly and her girlfriend Sandy. The two teenagers did not get far. The next day, they were found and taken into custody at Tybee Island on the Georgia coast. Sandy cooperated with investigators almost immediately. Holly was more guarded at first, though later, as part of a deal, she agreed to lay out exactly how the night had unfolded. When the girls were asked why, the answer they gave was almost unbearable in its simplicity. They had done it, they admitted, so that they could be together. The grandparents had stood between them, disapproving of their relationship and trying to keep them apart, and so the girls had removed the obstacle. Investigators also concluded that Holly had been the driving force, and that she had manipulated Sandy into helping her carry it out, much like other young women in this video bent someone close to them towards something monstrous. Both girls were charged as adults. They faced 2 counts of the most serious homicide charge Georgia law has, along with additional counts and an armed robbery charge, and the most they could have received was life, with no possibility of release. Because of their ages, the ultimate penalty was never on the table. In April of 2005, Holly Harvey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of that top homicide charge. Standing before Fayette County Superior Court Judge Pascal English, she spent about half an hour recounting what she had done, choking back sobs as she spoke softly through it. She was sentenced to 2 life terms, one after the other, which means she would have to serve roughly 20 years before she could even be considered for parole. Sandy Ketchum pleaded guilty as well, to homicide and armed robbery, and received 3 life terms to be served at the same time. Both young women remain incarcerated in Georgia all these years later. Holly, for her part, tried at one point years afterward to challenge the guilty plea she had entered, arguing through the courts that it should be revisited, but those efforts did not free her. The 2 consecutive life terms have held. What makes this case sit so heavily is the nature of the betrayal. The other young women in this video turned on rivals, on partners, on people they had reasons, however twisted, to resent. Holly Harvey turned on the 2 people who had done nothing but try to save her. Carl and Sarah Collier had no part in any love triangle. They were not anyone's competition. They were an elderly couple who took in a struggling grandchild, set rules they believed would protect her, and kept loving her even as she told them she hated them. Their attempt to pull her away from drugs and from a relationship they feared was, in the end, the thing that marked them. They could not imagine the girl in their basement was capable of what she did, and that inability to believe it is part of what left them so defenseless. There is also the chilling gap between Holly's age and her calculation. She was 15, and yet she gathered the blades, tested them, used the smell of marijuana to lure her grandparents to their deaths, and wrote out a checklist on her own skin to keep herself on task. That is not the impulsiveness people expect from a teenager in a rage. It is planning. It is the same cold, step-by-step removal of an inconvenient human life that has run through nearly every story here, just carried out by someone barely old enough to drive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Holly Harvey turned on the family who had taken her in, all to hold on to a relationship she had been ordered to give up. The final young woman in this video took that exact impulse to its furthest and darkest conclusion. Her story is the youngest of them all, and for many people it is the hardest one to absorb because of just how much and how many she was willing to lose in order to keep the person the world was trying to pull her away from. Section 10, 12 years old. On the morning of April 23, 2006, police in the quiet prairie city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada, walked into a home and found a family destroyed. Medicine Hat is a small city of only around 60,000 people, the kind of place where serious violence is rare and a whole community knows the families on a given street. What had happened inside that house would shake not just the neighborhood, but the entire country. 3 people were gone. Mark Richardson, 42, his wife Deborah, 48, and their little boy, 8-year-old Tyler. They had built an ordinary, decent life. Mark and Deborah had both struggled with drugs years earlier, but they had gotten clean and stayed clean, and by every account they were devoted parents raising their children in a safe, stable home. Now the parents had been attacked in the basement, and the little boy in his upstairs bedroom, and none of them had survived. There was one member of the family unaccounted for, the 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine. At first, the police feared the worst for her too. They thought she might be a victim who had been taken. They put out an alert and told the public they were searching for her in connection with a serious family situation, hoping she was still alive somewhere out there. She was alive, but she was not a victim. She was the reason it had happened. To understand how a 12-year-old ends up at the center of something like this, you have to understand the year that came before it. Jasmine had been, by the accounts of people who knew her, a happy and social kid, born in the autumn of 1993 into what looked from the outside like a settled home. Then something shifted. She drifted into a darker world. She began spending more and more time online, and she grew fascinated with grim and shocking things, with a controversial shock rock musician, and even with the lives of notorious killers. It was the kind of fixation that, looking back, was a warning sign nobody fully read in time. And in the middle of that drift, she met a man named Jeremy Steinke, reportedly at a punk rock show. This is the part of the story that has to be named plainly, because it is the root of everything else. Steinke was 23 years old. Jasmine was 12. He was a high school dropout who told people strange things about himself, including the claim that he was a centuries-old creature out of a horror story. There is no soft way to describe an adult becoming involved with someone so much younger than himself. It was not a healthy situation, whatever the two of them called it. It was a deeply inappropriate connection, and Jasmine's parents saw it for exactly what it was. They did the thing any responsible parents would do. They forbade it. They tried to keep this man away from their daughter, and they were right to try. That is the entire reason their lives were changed forever. Jasmine, furious that her parents were standing between her and Steinke, came up with a plan to remove that obstacle. Not just her parents, but her younger brother too. Her whole family. The Crown later suggested the idea may have been shaped in part by a film Steinke was obsessed with, a movie about a young couple who end the lives of the girl's parents and then go on a violent spree together. Whatever the influence is, the plan came down to the two of them deciding that the people standing in the way simply had to be gone, so that they could be together. On that April night, Steinke came to the Richardson home. He got into the basement wearing a mask and carrying a blade. He attacked Deborah there, and when Mark heard his wife and came to help, Mark fought back as hard as he could, even grabbing a screwdriver to try to defend himself, but he was overwhelmed. By one account, when Mark asked the masked man why he was doing this, Steinke told him that it was what his daughter wanted. Upstairs, the 8-year-old was attacked in his bedroom and did not survive. Here the story splits, and it is important to be honest that it does. Steinke and Jasmine each told different versions of who did what to the little boy. Steinke said it was Jasmine who ended her brother's life. Jasmine said Steinke directed her and then finished it himself. A court would later weigh those accounts, but the disagreement over that single most terrible detail has never been fully settled between the two of them. Afterward, the two of them fled together. What undid them was the same thing that undoes so many young people now, the digital trail they left behind. The pair had exchanged messages, and once investigators recovered evidence from Jasmine's bedroom and her school locker and pieced those communications together, the missing girl they had feared was a victim instead became their prime suspect. They were tracked down and arrested the very next day across the provincial line in neighbouring Saskatchewan, found together in a truck. Investigators were helped along not only by those private messages, but by people who knew the pair, some of whom later testified that the two had openly admitted to what they had done. For a community that had first been told to fear for a missing little girl, learning that the girl had helped plan the whole thing was almost impossible to absorb. Then came the courts, and the two paths could not have been more different because of the gap in their ages. Jeremy Steinke, as an adult, faced the full weight of the system. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and in December of 2008, he was sentenced to 3 life terms with no chance at parole for 25 years. He has since changed his name and now goes by Jackson May. Jasmine, because she was only 12 when it happened, was dealt with as a youth. In July of 2007, after she had already turned 13, a jury in Medicine Hat took only about 3 hours to find her guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. With that verdict, she became the youngest person in Canadian history ever convicted of multiple counts of the most serious homicide charge there is. But being handled as a youth meant something enormous for what came next, and it is the part that still stuns people. The most the law would allow for someone her age was 10 years. That was the ceiling, no matter what she had done. In November of 2007, she received that maximum youth sentence of 10 years, and even that was not structured as straight prison. It was built around rehabilitation, with a period of secure custody, roughly 4 years of treatment in a psychiatric hospital, and a final stretch of supervision out in the community. She was given credit for the 1.5 years she had already spent in custody. Because she had been a child when it happened, Canadian law also shielded her identity, which is why, in her own country, she was known to the public for years only by her initials rather than her name. And so the most haunting fact about this case is not only what she did, it is what happened afterward. Jasmine Richardson served her 10 years, and on the 6th of May 2016, she walked free. She was 22. The judge who had overseen her case from the very beginning said at her final review that she had met every single goal of her rehabilitation, without exception, and that she was considered a low risk to ever offend again. He even told her that he believed her parents and her brother would be proud of how far she had come, which is a startling thing to say to a person convicted of ending those very lives, and a measure of how completely the system had come to believe in her recovery. Some of her former neighbours did not share that belief at all. They were angry and sickened that the person responsible for wiping out an entire family was already finished paying for it. Today, by various accounts, she lives quietly under a different name, working a steady job and living on her own, an ordinary adult life, while the family she was born into no longer exists at all. If this story feels familiar after everything else in this video, that is not an accident. We have already seen a young woman turn on the family who stood between her and a forbidden relationship, when 15-year-old Holly Harvey ended the lives of the grandparents who were trying to keep her from the person she loved. This is that same impulse, the same refusal to accept a boundary set by the people supposed to protect her, except taken to its furthest possible edge. Holly turned on two grandparents. Jasmine turned on her mother, her father, and a small child. The entire family in one night, and she was 3 years younger when she did it. It is the pattern of this whole video pushed to the point where it can go no further. That outcome forces the single hardest question in this entire video, and it is worth ending the cases on it rather than pretending there is an easy answer. How responsible is a 12-year-old? On one hand, this was not a moment of blind panic. It was planned. A child sat with the idea of removing her own mother, her own father, and her own little brother, and then helped carry it out, all to stay with a grown man who never should have been anywhere near her. That is chilling no matter the age of the person who did it. And by what came out in court, the plan did not even begin with the older man. It was Jasmine herself who first put forward the idea of getting rid of her family, with Steinke agreeing to help her carry it out. And that detail is part of what made the case so hard for people to wrap their heads around. On the other hand, she was 12, under the influence of an adult who was, by any honest reading, exploiting her, with a brain still years away from being fully formed and a view of the world that had been warped both by that man and by the dark corners of the internet she had crawled into. The law looked at all of that, decided a child could be rebuilt, gave her 10 years, and let her start over. The entire foundation of Canada's youth justice system is the belief that a child is not yet a finished person, that a 12-year-old can be remade in a way a hardened adult often cannot be, and her quiet release in 2016 was that belief being tested in just about the most extreme case anyone could imagine. Whether that was justice or a failure of justice is something reasonable people still argue about, and there may simply be no clean answer to find. What is certain is the cost, and the cost is total. An entire family, 3 people including an 8-year-old who never got the chance to grow out of childhood, gone in a single night. A mother and a father who did nothing wrong except try to protect their daughter from a predator and who were ended for it, and a small boy who simply happened to be home in his own bed. There is no rehabilitation, no second chance, and no release date that brings any one of them back, and there never will be. Mark and Deborah had fought their way out of addiction to build that home, which makes the way it all ended even more bitter. Across all 10 of these stories, from a teenager who left a threat sitting on a phone to a child who plotted against the family that loved her, the same dark thread keeps surfacing, and it is worth naming clearly before we try to make sense of all of it together. In nearly every case, the spark was love, or jealousy, or rejection. The most ordinary human feelings there are, the very same ones that pass through almost every person alive without ever turning into anything dangerous at all. The question the rest of this video has been quietly circling, and the one that is worth sitting with now, is what it was that allowed that ordinary feeling in these particular young people, and not in the millions of others who feel it, to curdle into something so far beyond it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.